Iowa fans, this is your time here at the Voice of College Football. Welcome in for another Tuesday edition of Iowa Hawkeyes Live right here at the Voice of College Football. Settle in, and when you do, please hit the like button and grab some other college football fans and bring them on in. We're going to look ahead to Iowa's rematch with Michigan of sorts that will take place at the end of September. And to do so, we've got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast, and of course, our co-host here, Corey Brad, from the Hawkeye of the Storm. Get on over there to From the Hawkeye of the Storm with Corey. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you?
Doing just fine. Appreciate you joining us for this as we go through Iowa's schedule week to week and size up the opponents. So for the Hawkeye faithful here, that the last they saw of Michigan football was not much of a memory for the Hawkeye fans here, watching Aiden Hutchinson take a beeline to Spencer Petras over and over and over and over again. Just talk about what the Wolverines bring back, because most of us know about the great NFL losses that they'll have to endure.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, you and I have talked before. There's like this internet legend that Michigan rolled 37 fifth-year seniors out last year, and we'll be starting a bunch of, midterm high school freshmen or college freshmen this year. But the reality is that 33 of the 47 players that were on the Orange Bowl 2 deep return. And there's a reason why that Harbaugh and his assistants in the prove it or lose it contract were given 2-year deals. It's because this is actually the year that it was anticipated that they would make the move. That last year it was essentially, they'll win maybe 7-8 games, enough to maybe hold the Steve Deaces of the world at bay. But 2022 would be the year they would make a run at the title. And so this is going to be the deepest Michigan team that I've seen in a long time, probably going back to the Lloyd Carr era, maybe the 2016 that started 11-0. It's been a long time since I can remember that Michigan is essentially 3 deep at every single position, with one exception, maybe linebacker. I think that's one spot where Iowa, I think, will have a clear personnel advantage. But I've not had a chance to say this a lot, going back to when I used to do local sports radio in Iowa. It's been a long time since I could say there's maybe a handful of Iowa players that would start on this Michigan team, but I could say it this year. I think outside of linebacker, I don't know how many other players on Iowa's returning team would start. And I'm assuming Kirk will have a very good team. He always does. But Michigan has recruited very well the last few years, but they've done a much better job of retaining those players. I think I told you last year that the best talent in this program was in the youngest 2 classes, and those classes are now a year older. So it's a terrible matchup for Iowa. It's a little bit like playing a team that plays your style with better talent, but it's terrible timing for Michigan. Michigan has struggled playing in Iowa City going back to when I was a kid in the 80s. And the timing of the game, where Michigan's going to open the first 4 weeks of the year basically naming the score, and then go right from there to playing on the road at Kinnick, and depending on if it's Fox's week to pick the game or not. If it's not, it'll be a night game. If it is, it'll be an 11 a.m. game. So I don't like the timing of the game at all for Michigan, but it's a bad matchup for Iowa. It's bad timing for Michigan.
Steve, I got to pipe in here for a second. Can I see your left palm? Can I see your left palm? And I just want to make sure there's no foreign substance, no pine tar. All right, we're good
Nice.
there, Steve.
Nice.
Little zing there for you. I know this is a Michigan show, and we're Michigan Iowa show, and I know we're going to stick to that. Mark, I know you got a number of topics to get to as it relates to this matchup specifically. But a lot of people maybe on this channel, Steve, don't realize that you're an Iowa guy. I think you kind of alluded to that. You live in Iowa. You're a great resource as it relates to, I think, a pretty unbiased viewpoint on the situation here in Iowa. And people get after me for being critical, calling me a hater for some of the things I've said over recent months, just on how Kirk has run this program over the past few years. And of course, you know what I'm talking about, the situation with Brian Ferentz and the promotion. I want to get your thoughts for anybody here that has not heard your thoughts, because I know you do the Bigger 10 podcast and you discuss these things on a regular basis, but you know the timeline here. You've got Ken O'Keefe, the highest paid quarterbacks coach in the country prior to his departure. Brian Ferentz, an offensive coordinator who really has never produced anything resembling a competent offense. You got Chuck Long going on the record on KCJJ in Eastern Iowa, calling the whole situation nepotism. We talked about it. Mark and I have talked about it. Randy Hedberg, quarterbacks coach at North Dakota State, was interested in the job at Iowa. Iowa didn't even entertain that notion because Brian Ferentz was the QB's coach in waiting, apparently, for a former offensive lineman. Just your thoughts on the whole situation. Again, I know you've talked about it plenty, but I've lost a little bit of respect for Kirk over recent months. I still think he's a very high character guy, but how difficult is it right now given the situation with his son?
So, I have a long history with Kirk Ferentz. It's been several years since I've had a meaningful conversation with him, since I've moved full time from sports into news and politics. But him and I broke in together. My first year in sports talk radio was his first year at the University of Iowa. I had a very good relationship with him for many years. He was always very kind to me at a low point in my career. I had actually gotten fired for my job right before Iowa football media day, and my boss destroyed me in the newspaper. And in front of my media peers, Kirk actually came over and put his arm on my shoulder and gave me a pep talk. I've got pictures with Kirk and my kids. All right, so I'm not an Iowa fan, but I have known Kirk for many years, and I think it speaks to how much goodwill he built into the bank, that he survived the sort of controversies with race and everything else that went on a couple of years ago, because we live in an age where we've gone from overlooking those issues to maybe being too hypersensitive to them, in my view. And so now anytime you're tainted with that label at all, it's instantaneous guilt. And there's no way, without all the goodwill and reputation he had earned, that he would have survived. Okay. But talking football, we all, and you'll know this as you get older, brother. I'm starting to get to that age now. I'm starting to get, I just hired this will answer your question, I promise. I just hired my oldest daughter to run my TikTok and Instagram accounts for my show. Why? Because I'm almost 50 years old and more people are on Instagram and TikTok than are on Facebook now. And damn it, I just don't want to learn how to use Instagram and TikTok. Screw them. I don't want to learn. I don't care. And I'll hire somebody. My point is, we do reach this sort of get off my lawn, old man yells at cloud, Gran Torino. I didn't understand it when I was your age. Okay. I remember Don Patterson telling me that Hayden Fry couldn't remember the names of assistant coaches his last couple of years at Iowa. And I remember I was about your age when he told me those things. And I'm like, why the hell is he still coaching? I totally get it now. I'm about that age, And so I do think there's a little bit of, because I earned it. I don't have to care what, some schmucks on a YouTube channel think. I don't even know what a YouTube is. All right. And there can be in an era where everybody's really flighty and constantly seeking social media affirmation. It is kind of nice every now and then to have someone give 0 F's about something, right?
Sure.
But you also got to ultimately look at the results, and you have to be aware of the fact that when the OC's name is Brian Ferentz, that you're going to open yourself up to those kinds of charges. And I've known Chuck Long for a long time. And I don't know how much love lost there is between him and Kirk, because when Kirk took over the program, he froze out a lot of the old players, including Chuck. That was 20, 25 years ago, but people have long memories. So I just think that when you elevate your son, and it's really no different than any Iowa offense we've ever seen, minus the annoying bubble screens. All right. But when you anoint your son, that adds a little added extra layer of scrutiny, especially when it's pretty obvious to anybody with an IQ above 14 that the hope here is some form of ascension plan, right? That he's being set up to be the successor here. And if there's anything Gary Barta has shown, it's that he likes giving contracts to people with the name Ferentz, right? And so the fans like you know this too. You can read the tea leaves. And so you want to know, okay, are we going to move into the 21st century here with a new coach, or are we going to stick in? So we're going to get all the things about Kirk Ferentz that we don't like, and none of the stuff we do, right? That's what you fear about a Brian Ferentz as a head coach, and he has not shown really that he can break the mold. You're getting the same performance out of him you'd get from virtually anybody that Kirk hired for that position.
I think the argument that I've made, Steve, is you're right. And I'm not saying you're implying that, well, Brian's just running Kirk's offense and these are the results regardless of who's operating as the OC. But I think the argument could also be made. He's had 3 OCs throughout his tenure. Is it just possible that Kirk doesn't know how to hire? Is that possible? Because Ken O'Keefe, we want to worship Ken O'Keefe.
Right.
You're right. There were, 2000, with the exception being 2002, and even the Greg Davis. Everybody got after Greg Davis, but Greg Davis did lead them in part to that 12-0 season in 2015, which I get there's some skepticism about how real that was given the schedule. But can the argument be made that maybe the evaluation process as it relates to hiring an OC is just not there for Kirk?
Well, let me go. First of all, I meant to mention this when you brought up the baseball thing. We got totally screwed in that Louisville game yesterday. So schadenfreude, it worked itself out. If you're an Iowa fan, you should be okay with that. All right. But Ryan Day is going into his 4th year. He's on his 4th defensive coordinator. Okay. And so I think the one constant here is Kirk. I think you're running the offense that Kirk wanted to run. And I think that's fine but the problem is when your name's Brian Ferentz and your pre-hire resume doesn't really justify this hire. So we all know why you're being hired. Okay. Then there's the hope or expectation. I heard this a lot when Brian first got hired. He'll be able to talk to the old man. He'll be able to, say things to him no one else could. And Kirk will listen. He'll bring the old man into the 21st century. And now that is not happening. And so there's a real sense of then what is Brian Ferentz's value then, right? I mean, what was the point? And that's where you do get the sort of nepotism charges. I think the real issue for Iowa football, and this is an issue, I think, for every program except for, a rotating list of 10 or 15 blue bloods in the sport at any given time, is there a next level for you or not? And I think where I don't know that I've ever said this in my career. If I could defend Gary Barta, because I don't think much of him as an AD, but if I could defend him for a moment, if you made me defend him, I would say, how many programs fired the guy like Ferentz or allowed him to move on because they were going to go to the next level and then lost their way in that process, right? There's a school right one state over here, Nebraska, that can tell you a cautionary tale about that. My team, I could tell you the cautionary tale about when Lloyd stepped down and Michigan tried to hire Kirk Ferentz. His daughter was going to Michigan at the time, and Kirk turned them down. And yet the Lloyd Carr faction went off to see if they could hire Pat Fitzgerald. And you had the former players wanted Les Miles, and the administration didn't want any part of Les Miles. And so went off and tried to get their own guy. And Greg Schiano said no. And suddenly now, Rich Rodriguez falls in their lap. But there really wasn't a vetting process about a cultural fit. There's so many stories like that where you think you have another level, so we move on from the guy that we had, and then that next level is actually the way down. And I think if I could defend Iowa in any respects, it would be that fear of repeating that history. You're not old enough to remember this. I used to work with a guy named Jim Zabel, who called Iowa games more than anybody else. And he'll tell, I used to hear the stories from him, working with him in the afternoons on WHO. I mean, he used to tell me about working 20 straight years without a winning season. I used to hear all those stories until Hayden Fry showed up, And so that's where I think Iowa has some fear, which is if we try to take that next step, do we actually take a step back?
And here's the last thing. And then Mark, I'll throw it back over to you because I know we want to move on from this subject, but again, piggybacking off this is Kirk's offense. This is Kirk's comfort zone. Not really giving the reins to Brian. And of course, that's not a new theory. We've heard that tossed around for years, really. But what I don't understand, Steve, is if Brian is the head coach in waiting, or at least that's what we all assume that's what Kirk wants. I don't know how that's not possible. That's what Kirk wants. We know that. Why on earth would you hold back if that's actually happening? Why would you hold back Brian from changing things? You've got an offense that's ranked 123rd in total offense. He ain't getting appointed. He ain't getting hired as a head coach with 123rd ranked offense. I don't care if his last name is Ferentz. It's not happening.
That's a great point. I think that's a great point. And And if you look at maybe, two of the best seasons or the two best seasons Kirk had, you had Brad Banks finish runner-up for the Heisman Trophy, and you had Drew Tate reset the Iowa passing, record book post Hayden Fry. And I don't understand not going and getting competition out of the transfer portal that made no mistake or no sense to me on any level whatsoever. I don't have good answers to those questions other than my story about hiring my daughter to run my TikTok account because I'm getting older and I don't want to learn. Okay. And that's about the best answer I can give you.
And let's remember, Steve, I've said this to Mark a million times. People have gotten tired of us talking about it. This was the most active year in the transfer portal at quarterback with competent passers and playmakers in the portal that we've ever seen, ever. And it might be the 1 year where they needed it the most. And they didn't even entertain it. Mark, anything to add to this?
Well,
this topic?
that was going to be my next point / comment / question to Steve that's the defense for the administration that you don't know. You want to stay with the proven fear that you're going to go into a situation that you don't want to be in. So why don't we stay with something? That's the defense for the administration. The defense for the coaching staff led by Kirk himself, I don't know what it is, because when you've been mired in the 100s in total offense, we posted a video here looking at what the metrics have looked like for the last 15 years, and you're going 8-4 on average, and you've got the special teams and the defense nailed down. Why don't you? It's not even taking a risk. I don't think there's only upside there in making personnel changes and in updating your approach.
And to be clear, it'd be one thing if Kirk Ferentz was in a position where he's just trying to ride off into the sunset, and like you just brought up, just he wants to maintain the 8-4, 9-3 year in year out routine. But no, he's got to. The needle has to move on that side of the ball for his end goal, his master plan of getting Brian this job to actually transpire. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I know we want to move on from this topic, but I appreciate your perspective on it, Steve, because I feel like I was the only person throughout the last 6 months screaming for Iowa to go to the portal at quarterback. And the only explanation I ever got was, A, no quarterback wants to come to Iowa. And my response to that is, how the heck do you know that when you don't even try?
Right.
And B, he'll never do it. So I guess the latter is true, but it doesn't take away from the frustration. Mark, do you want to get into this matchup? We can talk more about Iowa, Michigan.
Well, we are certainly 5 months away from a matchup, so this is more to the point in regards to the landscape of the conference and these two teams in particular. I would just point to Kirk making certain comments that have been noticeable to me, because most coaches, when they put their team or their program up against the metrics, usually deal with the nation. And Kirk Ferentz seems to be so locked into the Big Ten, and that's not a criticism necessarily, as just an observation that I don't think is thinking national. I don't think he's thinking anything besides let's win this division, and whatever happens after that happens. And again, for a guy that's accomplished so much and brought this program to where it is, I just don't see the downside to trying to break through that glass ceiling of sorts.
And Steve, from what you understand to be true, is there any substance to the claim that if Kirk allows an outsider to change things drastically on offense as it relates to philosophy or play calling, whatever the case may be, or personnel, we are going to go out and get a dual threat guy, does that really take away from what I was trying to do on defense? Because I hear that all the time. Oh, this is complimentary football. I don't know how you can have 123rd ranked offense complement any defense. I think Mark has talked. I know how you feel about this, Mark. I think if anything, it's going to help the defense. Correct?
I agree, first of all, with the complementary defensive argument as a meta argument. And as I pointed out when we started talking about the matchup, I mean, I root for a program that has, Michigan and Iowa academically, athletically have just a lot of very similar cultures, similar, alumni, DNA kind of makeup. They're both legal, law, business, medical schools. So there's a lot of similarities. Jim's zanier, but his approach to things is very similar, frankly, to what Kirk did. But you'll note that the greatest moment Jim had as a head coach was when he yanked Alex Smith in the middle of a season when he was injured and put in Colin Kaepernick and rode that guy to 6 inches from winning a Super Bowl. And he literally brought, that a new kind of a spread offense to the NFL via that kind of couple of year run. And we're kind of having similar conversations on the Michigan side because Cade McNamara did a great job managing Michigan football last year. But we're sitting here with this 5-star right here that could have, had 60 scholarship offers. And we've never had, at least not in this century, a deeper and more explosive receiving core than we do right now. We had 6 or 7 guys, and I don't even know how we're going to throw, not even counting tight ends, how we're going to throw it to all these guys. I do know, though, I'd like to see what that looks like with a 5-star quarterback. And so a lot of Michigan fans are like, well, we're just going to sit here and hand the ball off for 40 times again. And I really don't think we're going to do that this year. And in fact, I wouldn't be shocked if JJ was the starter for your game by the time we got to that juncture. I think we did that last year to play complementary football. We had this go for broke defense. We kind of went the other way where we were really gambling on the defensive side with Don Brown. And then finally our corner recruiting took a 2-year dip and we couldn't defend guys man to man anywhere in the conference and got absolutely destroyed on defense. And so I think that this running style coincided with trying to rebuild the psyche of the defense and not put them on an island as much as they were on before under Don Brown. I suspect this year you will see Michigan throw the ball a lot more. But in Iowa's case, so I understand wanting to play complementary football, but I certainly don't think you go from, if you went from 123rd to 73rd on offense, I absolutely believe that would lower the margin for error defensively. Go back and watch our championship game that we played in December. For about a quarter and a half there, Michigan offensively could not, after the trick play to Blake Coram, really couldn't mount virtually anything for about a quarter and a half. But the inability of Iowa to do anything on the offensive end that put any pressure on Michigan at all, eventually that margin for error, just Iowa could not sustain that. And sooner or later, Michigan would start moving the football and did. And a game that was, not dramatic, but at least Iowa was in some form of shouting distance until we got about the middle of the third quarter. But then once it became obvious that Iowa's offense was never going to threaten our defense, I think that gave a big jolt of confidence to our offense. And then the route was on there in the last quarter and a half. And that kind of speaks to what you're talking about.
Steve, I know you have a lot of respect for Don Patterson, and we have Don Patterson on the show regularly. One of the things he's brought up, and I love how curt Don is because he cuts to the chase. But one of the things he's brought up is we don't have enough plays. I mean, we just don't simply run enough stuff. That's what
I laugh hearing a coach say that because I've said for decades watching Iowa.
Isn't that telling though, Steve?
It is zone stretch left, then flip the tight end to the other side, zone stretch right, run a waggle off of. And I know a lot of fans sit in the stands and think they can call plays, but they're really just calling run or pass. Sure. There's a lot more nuance and everything to that. But to hear a guy who's coached offensive football for as long as Don has, to hear him say what I've noticed as a layman, which is we don't really offer the other side, the defense, a lot of looks. I mean, I think that kind of speaks volumes there. And I really think that you just get to an age as a coach. We've seen this before, and you just don't want to change. And you're coming off one of the best seasons you've had in recent memory as well. Iowa just went 10-2, won the Big Ten West, should have won its bowl game, kind of collapsed there at the end. And this again goes to your point. Iowa has the ball with a chance to win at the end of the game. Did anyone watching that think that Spencer Petras was driving Iowa down the field to win that game? No one did. No sentient being in the 9 realms believed that was going to happen. Why? Because you know better. That's why. All right. And I think that's probably the greatest frustration if you're an Iowa fan. The great line that they used to say about Bear Bryant, that Keith Jackson used to say about Bear Bryant. He can take his and beat yours with his, and take yours and beat his with yours, right? Meaning that it didn't matter the scheme or anything. He would figure out a way to win. If you're an Iowa fan, I think your great frustration probably is that every week the game has to look an exact, specific, certain way for you to win, right? And then if the template of that game gets out, if you start coloring outside the lines a little bit, you're not going to win. The game has to look a certain way for Iowa to win. And I think that's probably the greatest frustration more than anything else. But again, we're still talking about a guy that's going to end up in the College Football Hall of Fame here.
And deservedly so. The problem with they went 10-2 last year is you've got obviously 10-4 ultimately, but 3 of the 4 losses were absolute pantsings, if that's a word, right? I mean, get completely destroyed against Wisconsin on the road, get completely pantsed at home by Purdue. You talked about the Big Ten championship game. And then everybody wants to talk about Iowa running the football well against Kentucky. We're going up against a depleted Kentucky team that was down several starters on defense. You're losing pretty darn good Big Ten back in Tyler Goodson, although I do think Iowa's okay at the running back spot. The other thing that should be brought up is the transfer portal. We've talked about quarterback. Iowa not really utilizing the portal. They got one guy coming in as a tight end from Lafayette University who's figuring to probably be third string behind Sam Laporta and Luke
That's
Lachey.
The most Ferentz thing of all time. We brought in one guy from the transfer portal, and it's a tight end.
Right.
See, as I get older, I find this stuff adorable.
Of course you do. You're a Michigan guy.
No, I don't mean that cynically. I just mean as I get older, I really grow to appreciate the stubbornness. I totally get it.
So, and I know I've talked about this as well, but Iowa's lost. Everyone's talking about, Iowa's only lost 6 scholarship guys to the portal. Every single scholarship guy they've lost to the portal has been an offensive skill player. All right. Every single one of them, not one defensive player, because people want to talk about, well, they're not going to play anyways. Well, there's defensive guys who aren't going to play, and they're not entering the portal right now. So that should tell us something. And obviously it's been well documented, the departure of Charlie Jones. And I've heard so many Iowa fans over the past 2 weeks want to downplay that and talk about how Charlie Jones was not going to play. That's just malarkey.
He was a Colt hero last year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. When it's convenient. So I guess let's transition a little bit to this game, specifically what I recall from the Big Ten championship game, not just Iowa's ineptitude on offense, but specifically Mark talked about Aiden Hutchinson terrorizing Spencer Petras and Jack Plum and, all of the offensive line, minus Tyler Linderbaum, of course, basically looking like middle schoolers out there against Ojabo and Aiden Hutchinson. So obviously Michigan's dealing with some loss there. From a pass rushing perspective, Iowa has experience returning, but they also lose their top 3 offensive linemen in Tyler Linderbaum, Kyler Schott, and Cody Ince. So how does Michigan match up in the trenches against Iowa?
This will look differently defensively this year. They have a new defensive coordinator. Mike McDonald parlayed last year's success into getting the DC job in Baltimore. Frankly, I thought the wrong Michigan assistant won the Broyles Award last year. If you look at what Josh Gaddis did, actually, we took the offensive reins away from Josh Gaddis. He may have still called a lot of the plays, but if you look at the scheme, we got away from the speed and space and got back to playing hardball. And so I thought the other Michigan assistant, Mike McDonald, is who should have won the Broyles Award last year. I mean, he came in and just absolutely revolutionized. In many respects, he did for the Michigan defense and its culture what Lincoln Riley did on the offensive side for Oklahoma when he took over as OC, and just changed the entire complexion of the program. The replacement for him, Mike Minter, is essentially a Mike McDonald disciple. They came up coaching together, come out of the same Raven coaching tree, and so we're going to run the exact same defensive scheme, but it will be more varied. Michigan will not get away with what it did last year, where you've got 2, maybe the best pass rushing duo I've ever seen at Michigan. And I've watched every game going back to the 70s, including before I became a fan. I don't ever remember. There's a lot of years we had an Ojabo or an Aiden. I don't ever remember a year we had an Ojabo and an Aiden. That doesn't happen very often in college football, period. Okay, so we're not going to play a lot of – we get to mix up our coverages now on the back end because we know we can just rush these 4 guys and not have to gamble. There will be more varied looks. We will blitz more. Junior Colson is to me is a bigger Devin Bush. I don't know if he'll be that good of a player, but physically very, very similar. I think you'll see him blitzed a lot. You got a glimpse of him last year, but Michigan has recruited extremely well in the defensive line. I'm not really worried about that position at all. It'll look different. I mean, we won't have as many sacks, but I think like the interior of the defensive front will be better than it was last year. The starting linebackers will be very athletic. I'm concerned about the depth behind them. The secondary, though, I think has a lot of speed and a lot of athleticism, and Michigan, especially in this most recent class, recruited very, very well back there. So it'll look different than what Iowa saw before. And I think actually I'm more worried about playing a multiple offense because we are going to have to blitz more and be a little more aggressive than we were last year. I don't know that makes any difference, frankly, against Iowa. I'm not trying to be patronizing or play into your lament here that we've already discussed, but this is why I just think it's a bad matchup for Iowa. Okay, it's a bad matchup for Iowa, but it's a bad spot and timing for the matchup for Michigan. I don't really see this is going to be the wrong year, I think, to try to line up and run downhill against Michigan. I think this would be the wrong year to do that. And so I just don't see, unless Iowa pulls out the turnover monkey, which it can do as well as anybody in the country, I don't see minus a +3 turnover ratio, even if it is at night. I think Iowa can uglify the game a little bit, but I don't know how they get to, say, 21 points to win the game.
So you think Michigan can win this game with a -3 turnover ratio?
No, I think that's where Iowa has to be, is +3 to win.
Okay.
Otherwise, I think Michigan offensively, guys, Michigan's going to be loaded. This is the most loaded I've seen Michigan offensively probably since, Drew Henson, David Terrell, and all those guys were on the same team. Donovan Edwards and Blake Coram. It's the most explosive combination of running backs Michigan has had since Wheatley and Biaka Batuka. And brother, you won't even remember those names, but Mark will. Now it'll be fascinating on 3rd and short. The last 2 years under Hassan Haskins, Najee Harris and Hassan Haskins got more yards after contact than any 2 running backs in college football the last 2 years. And so when you have Haskins in back there, 3rd and 3 is a running down, or at least you can pretend that it is. When a guy's getting 3.5 yards after contact every time he touches the ball. I think that'll be fascinating to see how Michigan compensates for that. But I think they'll compensate for it by throwing a lot more to backs out of the backfield. And I think that's going to be very open given how deep and explosive Michigan is at receiver. I just think it's a bad matchup for Iowa. I do. But I just think it's bad timing of the matchup for Michigan. If Michigan executes, it'll win. If it plays like it played in 2016, where it turned the ball over and played uber conservative with a quarterback with a bad shoulder, then Iowa could win 12-10 or 16-13 or something like that. But I don't know, barring terrible weather or turnovers, even a really stout Iowa defense, I don't know how it would hold Michigan to less than 24 points. And
the difference in 2016 is Iowa actually had a competent quarterback and still didn't reach 20.
Right.
In 2019, you talk about the Nate Stanley year, and I know that was a Don Brown defense, correct?
Yeah.
2019.
Yep.
That game, Mark, you remember that game? It was a noon game on Fox. It was one of the more painful games I'd ever seen in my life. I think it was 10-3, right, Steve?
It was
10-3 in Ann Arbor.
You got a chance. You saw your mirror image. Michigan had no confidence in Shea Patterson at all. Just completely took the ball out of his hands and said, "We got to win this in a rock fight." Well, you know what that's like. You see that how many times a year as an Iowa fan where we just don't believe the quarterback can win the game. So just take the ball out of his hands. And that's what happened in 2019.
And so it especially felt like a rock fight for Nathan Stanley because, man, he got beat up in that game.
And one of the toughest guys to ever play the quarterback position in Iowa, regardless of fundamentals. And I think he struggled in that department. But, yeah, I mean.
What happened to Iowa, if you go back and watch that game in 2019, is Don Brown, which he rarely did. I mean, Don Brown would just kind of play the same defense regardless. This is an Ohio State fan, Mark. It didn't matter, down or distance. We're playing man-to-man all over the field, man. In that game, though, he switched things up. In that game, we started playing a zone blitz scheme. And you go back and watch that, you'll see our linebackers coming up those interior gaps in a zone blitz scheme and just absolutely rock Nathan Stanley's world. And that was one of the rare times in all the years that Don was here that we actually saw him mid-game adjust his philosophy and game plan. Rarely did that.
Could we imagine the execution from Michigan in that game versus Spencer Petras at quarterback? I mean, because you're talking about one of the toughest suckers to ever play quarterback.
Yeah, he never fumbled or anything. All those sacks, all those hits. No. Not sure Spencer Petras would have held on to the ball taking all those hits. Yeah.
So Don Brown somehow figured that was the route to go against Iowa, and he gave up 3 points, and so it proved successful. But he wouldn't at least give that a shot a few weeks later against Ohio State and give up 56.
Don't even get me started, Mark.
Okay.
Don't even get me started.
Just like you mentioning Biaka Batuka and the numbers 3, 1, and 3, instantly I'm conditioned for those to pop into my head immediately. Okay. So the one thing I will say, Steve, is you touched on the quarterback situation in Michigan a few minutes ago. And for all the Wolverines football that we talk on pretty much a weekly basis, I rarely get to fire the questions at you. So how would you handle that situation? Because when it was reversed, okay, Cade McNamara has done nothing to lose this job, as he has proudly stated, I am the Big Ten championship quarterback. And that's great. 15 touchdowns, 4 picks. He makes the right reads, the right decisions, all those things. And then you had JJ, who you could bring in as the specialty player to change things up, keep him engaged, keep him involved, keep him motivated. But it also worked strategically to give the defense something else to look at. But Cade McNamara is not going to fill that role as a number 2 quarterback. You know, how do you handle this situation? Because he's not done anything to lose the job. And most likely, especially against the first 3 or 4 opponents, and probably the entire schedule, would not do anything to lose the job, but he is not the better talent.
You know, go back to the playoff game against Georgia in the Orange Bowl. And I mean, look at the NFL draft, guys. We played that team 10 times. They're winning 7 or 8. Okay. But 2 things conspired there. Michigan played its worst game of the year, and then that was against by far the best team it had played all year. And some of the Georgia people afterwards, when they got to look at J.J. McCarthy in the fourth quarter, were like, you weren't playing that guy the entire time? What the hell's going on here? Okay. And I don't know what it made much of a difference whatsoever in the outcome. But Michigan, I think, actually, Mark, caught a break with McCarthy taking the spring away to rest his shoulder, and here's why. Because I think this tension that you just described would have been brought to boil right away, right? With an entire offseason for McCarthy. And McCarthy's not like your typical young quarterback where the old guy has won over his teammates and he's the team leader. And the McCarthy is every bit as respected by the players. I mean, he just held a camp in Chicago. A whole bunch of Michigan players came to it. He's very well respected amongst his peers. So I think him not being able to throw in the spring actually alleviated some of this tension a little bit, and it gives Harbaugh an out to essentially start Cade as the starter to start the year. And then we get into the meat of the schedule, and you'll see JJ play even more than he played last year. And we get into the meat of the schedule. I don't think it'll be against Iowa. I don't know that will be the first on the road, toughest road environment all year, Kinnick at night. I don't know that's the one where they'll put him in, but remember they did it against they put him in at halftime against Wisconsin last year, and that drive basically sparked Michigan to that route win. I suspect it'll be shortly after that we'll kind of see a Trevor Lawrence and who's the kid at
Kelly
Clemson?
Bryant.
I think you might see that scenario eventually play itself out. Whereas I think if JJ were there all spring, then you might be worried that Cade might see the writing on the wall and had hit the transfer portal by May 1. And then you're really depleted at quarterback. I think this kind of gave Michigan an out. You can now start Cade against the scrubs to start the year, play JJ even more, then just try to get through that Iowa game, given where it's at in the schedule, win it by, who cares what the score is or how ugly it is, just get out of there with a W. And then as you start building towards later in the year, when you have Michigan State and Penn State coming up late in October, and they're both at home, I think by then, if provided he's healthy, that is when you'll see J.J. McCarthy fully in charge at Michigan.
So if McNamara is hitting 60 or 65% of his passes, throwing for 2.25 a game, making few mistakes, and he starts the season as the starter, and he's going to roll up some nice numbers, probably better than that against the first 3 or 4 scrubs, that Harbaugh is just going to bench him.
Well, first of all, I don't know that he's capable of that, what you just said. I mean, they didn't completely – they took the ball out of his hands like we just talked about Iowa with Shea Patterson. They did that with Cade against Washington last year. And I know Washington had 2 guys that got picked in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft, but okay, that's 2 of the guys in your secondary. What about everybody? They did this a couple of other times last year where they kind of took the ball out of his hands. So I don't know that he's capable of what you're describing. But if he's doing
was against Michigan State.
Everybody did that against Michigan
great.
State secondary last year. They were the worst secondary in our entire conference last year. But if he's doing that weekly, then of course they're not going to make the switch. I just don't know that he's capable of that. The thing about Cade that is really alarming when you watch film on him, the reads, the throws he does not make. I mean, I could take you and walk you through several game films where guys are wide open for intermediate throws, and he just won't make that throw. He doesn't trust his arm. And the way we play football, we have to, this is an NFL style of offense. We have to have a quarterback that can make that 15 to 20 yard on a rope throw. Otherwise, you saw it against Georgia. We just end up getting bam-boxed and can't move the line of scrimmage and can't move you off of the line of scrimmage. And I don't know that Cade McNamara can do that, but he'll get the chance to do it this year. And hey, I love him as a kid. I'm very thankful for what he did for us last year. No question about it. But you got a Ferrari, warming up there in the garage, brother. So at some point, you got to let that puppy out. You got to let it breathe.
Oh, I completely agree. I completely agree with the decision. I'm just curious to see how it's going to be handled. And also, yeah, there's a cut up version of JJ.
Well, there's another aspect of this too, Mark. Pardon me, I should mention. And this is where NIL comes in. McCarthy's making huge NIL money. So let's say we even went through another year where Cade started every game, but JJ played even more. He's making a crap ton of money, like 6-figure NIL money. All right. So without NIL, I think there'd be more pressure about worrying about losing him. Okay. But hey, he's making all kinds of NIL money. If Cade starts every game again this year, and we'll see again, and he plays more, I think that has a way of smoothing some of those things over.
Let me just add this to the mix too. I know because everybody's going to walk away thinking that I just came on here with an agenda to hate on Kirk. I don't think there is a better defense on Michigan's schedule, Steve. Is that true? I don't think it's even close.
I agree with that. I agree, because you look at Penn State, they're losing Brett Pry, they're losing Ebikite, they're losing Brisker. Those were probably the two best players on their defense last year. You're bringing a new DC. Now, the new DC, Manny Diaz, of course, has a great reputation, sure. But at the very least, Iowa is the second best defense on Michigan's schedule. But I would agree. I think it is going to be the best.
And who's after defense. Iowa and Penn State? I mean, there's a drop-off in there.
I agree. Yeah.
Penn State had a more talented defense than Iowa last year. I don't think they were more better. They were more talented.
That's a good way of putting it.
That should have been a great defense. Yeah. I think James Franklin underachieved more than anybody in the country last year. That was not a 7-6 team. Now, Ohio State, we'll see what they bring by game 12 with Jim Knowles and with their talent.
Sure. Prove it to me.
Yeah. This is the fan in me jumping up here, because they've got the most talented defense. If you're just talking about talent, Ohio State's got the most talented defense that Michigan's going to face. And that's not even close, but they're not performing. But they're going to have
let me add one more thing to the mix as it relates to Iowa, Steve, because I want to get your take on it, because I know we've kept you for a long time here. Brian Ferentz was asked at the beginning of spring practice. Media person actually read Brad Banks' stat line from 2002 and basically asked him the question, is this the ideal stat line for you as an offensive coordinator for a quarterback? And his response was no. He said, we prefer, because of course Brad Banks ran for 400 some yards on the ground that year. And his response was, no, we want our quarterback to basically be a facilitator. We don't want him running all over the yard. So is that just Brian Ferentz putting his foot in his mouth? Or because it's almost like there's an agenda to make the fans upset. I mean, that's how dumb that comment comes across. Even Mark.
So I don't know Brian Ferentz, so I covered him as a player, never had a meaningful conversation with him. But
well, he looked lost in that press conference. I can tell you that.
That strikes me as some of the things I see in my daily work covering news and politics, where someone gets cornered with a question that there's no good answer for, and the gears start grinding and realize which of these runny turd answers leaves me the least soiled
Good point.
to throw out there. Because if he says, of course we would love to have that, then the next obvious question is, well, why did you come back with the same catch you had before? Why didn't you hit the portal? Why didn't you go the JUCO ranks? Why didn't you look to bring somebody like that in? And then he's double cornered. So here's one piece of advice I can give you as a guy who's worked in media now longer than you have, just because I'm older. Whenever they give you an answer, whether it's sports or politics or any endeavor, whenever the people you ask the $10,000, the $64,000 question to knowingly give you an answer that makes them look dumb, it's because they have made the choice that looking stupid is preferable to telling you the truth. That is why, every single time. All right.
That's a good answer, Mark. That's the best. Listen, that's the best explanation we've had, because I've asked that question to a number of people and I just get deer in the headlights. So that's the most intelligent answer I've had.
The direction of the offense and the decisions that are made, and I'm not that critical of this program or any program. It takes a lot to push me in that direction. Is just mind-boggling to me that it's not even taking the premise that this has worked elsewhere and it's working all over the country. It worked for you with Brad Banks. Why would you not want a guy who threatens the defense? This worked for 3 top 10 finishes. Well, I know that they went into another era there that he was only there for 02. But anyway.
Hey, but I remember Nathan Stanley. Nathan Stanley was very mobile as well. He was actually not much of a thrower. Actually could not throw the ball very well. Nathan Stanley, who was in between Banks.
You're talking about Drew Tate.
Drew Tate. Yeah.
You're not, who is, not Nathan Stanley. Who am I thinking of?
Drew Tate.
No, between Brad Banks and Drew Tate.
Nathan Chandler?
Nathan Chandler, thank you.
Yeah.
Chandler was very mobile, actually. He could not throw the ball very well. So all 3 of those years there that they finished number 8 in the country, all 3 years in a row, all 3 of them were with a very mobile quarterback.
And I know that 2015, I understand that schedule was weak. The offense still wasn't very good. They still went 12-0, and it was partly because C.J. Beathard was actually a threat to run.
Yeah.
So, and we want to love on the 10-2 last year. You and I both know Indiana was one of the worst teams. You go from being a top 15 team preseason to being one of the worst teams in the country in the FBS, and that was perceived to be a difficult crossover game for Iowa. You replace Indiana with, maybe you can argue Rutgers, but now you get Ohio State and Michigan as well. We've talked about it at length, Mark, but we know the schedule is completely. They're not going 10-2 in the schedule with the offense that they brought to the table last year. You're not going 10-2 with the schedule.
If you bring in a mobile quarterback for no other reason, then you don't even design anything for him. Just the threat to the defense when the play breaks down to make something happen. How much of benefit is that? And when you can line up 11 on 11, we all know the premise of why offensive football in college and now the NFL has gone the way it has is to say, we no longer want to play 10 on 11. We want to play 11 on 11 and threaten the defense.
Iowa wants to play 10 on 11. Iowa wants to play 10 on 11. So, we obviously it hasn't worked against Michigan. I don't know when's the last time Iowa scored 20 or more against Michigan, Steve? How far back do we have to go?
Wow.
I'd have to look
we'll get it with Nathan
series.
Chandler throwing to Razor Ramon. I'll never forget that. That tore my scrotum out. So not last year, not in 2019. That's a really good question. Was it against the Rich Rod year? Where like Michigan had a pick 6 to start that game off and Iowa came back and won. I know they did it against Denard in the Big House one year. I know they got over 20 against Denard one year, but it doesn't happen very often. No, you're right.
Boy, Ramon Ochoa. It's been a long time since I've heard that name.
Yeah, well, you're not as emotionally scarred by that as I am. So
they played back-to-back 30-28 and 38-28 games in 09 and 10.
There you go, against Denard, and those were the Rich Rod games.
Who was but who started that 2009 game? It wasn't
Ricky Stancy, probably.
No. I'm talking about for Michigan. Who started at quarterback?
Drew Tate started in 09, and then Denard started in 2010.
You mean Tate Forcier?
Forcier.
Or Tate Forcier. I'm
We're
sorry.
talking about Tate.
Yeah.
Forcier. Okay.
A lot of Tates, a lot of Chandlers out there.
Yes.
Nathans, all sorts of things going on there. It's great stuff with Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. Get on over there and check out the work there. And Steve is gracious enough to have me on from week to week, and we broke down some over-unders this week. So check out Michigan Podcast. And if you want to make some money, this is the guy right here. So Corey was part of our contributor series that we brought together for predictions on Patreon each and every week, as I would throw these guys a 12-pack. And you can get Steve's picks and my picks and everybody else's. And Steve is tough to track down. That's in regards to picking these games better than anyone.
Well, thank
Absolutely.
you, man. Appreciate you guys having me on. Take care.
Thank you, Steve.
All righty. Take care.
Good stuff from Steve. We got to have him on more often. I just enjoy, this is the guy that showed Mark. I just enjoy sitting back and being able to listen to his expertise, because again, this is not me just promoting this show. He is a great mind as it relates to Iowa football, because he's been around it. He's covered it. I thought his explanation on the whole Brian Ferentz quote early in the spring was spot on. I mean, because we talked about that press conference with Brian, that Brian just seemed kind of bewildered in that press conference. There wasn't a whole lot of sensible reasoning coming from Brian Ferentz. And I think perhaps it was just because he was uncomfortable, and it was the lesser of bad responses. So great stuff. I'm glad you got Steve on the show, and we'll have to have him back.
Well, I've got to think that, and this never crossed my mind before, for all the news conferences I used to go to, and the name Jackie Sherrill was brought up to me earlier today. I used to sit through his news conferences for 7 years in the SEC, but you got to think that some of these coaches really think through what could possibly be presented to them before these news conferences, and others probably don't give it a second thought. They're coaching football. That's all they care about is the football team. They hit the podium and whatever's addressed to them at the time. And based on their level of ability to communicate, cover up, and have experience communicating, it depends on whether they're going to present themselves well or not so much.
What I have a hard time understanding is how Brian Ferentz could have possibly went into that press conference not knowing that kind of type of question would arise. Agreed. Shortly after being promoted as the QB's coach in one of the more controversial moves of Kirk's tenure here. But with that being said, I think you're right. I will say this, what will be interesting in that game, and I know we kind of alluded to it a bit with Steve, what will be interesting in that game is timing, because I know maybe we make too much about, what time a game kicks off and what network, but because Fox now owns rights primarily for the Big Ten, right? I had first dibs at these games. Because of that does change. It actually hurts Iowa in games like this, because if they get that game as their marquee game, and I don't have the lineup, perhaps you do for that week, Mark, but if Iowa and Michigan is the marquee game for Fox, you're going to get an 11 a.m. kickoff, 11 a.m. local time kickoff. So that just does not help. I'd have to go back. I know the 2019 loss to Michigan in Ann Arbor was an 11 a.m. kick. We know Iowa won in 2016 after a terrible performance on the road at Penn State the week prior. They come back home and beat a top 5 Michigan team in 2016 in Kinnick, but it was a night game. And so I do think timing is a big part of this. And normally you want the marquee game, but I just, to me, I don't know if is it Fox just trying to not compete with ABC? Is that why their marquee game is always at noon?
So first of all, that is by far the marquee game in the Big Ten. Minnesota Purdue is a good one, but it's by far the best game of the week as it stands right now. Secondly, absolutely, and that's how it was marketed at the time and written up in media type publications at the time, is that Fox, instead of saying we're going to do the traditional approach and we're going to put our best game at night and we're going to go head to head with ABC and ESPN, considering, there's a ton of games on, but 3 major games on at prime time, that we're going to bail and we're going to say, you know what, let's put our best game of the week up against what is typically the third or fourth best game for any given network that they put at noon and attack it that way. Even though less people are watching football at noon or 11 a.m., because us people in the Eastern time zone tend to forget everybody else, so we're watching it at the latest possible time, and it's early in the morning from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. for the rest of the country. Even though less people are watching football then, especially earlier in the fall when the weather's decent, where people will be out and about during the day and then settle in for a college football game that night. They still have decided to take that approach to the point where we were fielding Oklahoma and Nebraska calls and comments from the live chat last week, Corey, during our Oklahoma/Nebraska show, because they've been put already at 11 a.m. by Fox. And to the degree that Fox is airing, listen to the primetime game on Fox that night to push Oklahoma and Nebraska to 11 a.m. local time. Ohio State and Toledo is the primetime game on Fox.
Is that a home and home? Ohio State and Toledo?
No.
Who did they? Oh, it was Tulsa last year. Ohio State.
Yeah, they played Tulsa
last year. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
they're not traveling to Toledo.
I agree with Tim in the chat. Michigan, the Big Ten, the Michigan Iowa game will likely be noon. I think it's terrible for the conference. I shouldn't say the conference. It's actually really good for the conference because, again, you get the spotlight, but it doesn't help the claim for upsets. And I'll say this, too. I was having a conversation with Coach Patterson yesterday, actually. He called me up, and we were talking actually some golf. And we got to talking about the Iowa schedule. And one game that scares me, Mark, and I know we've spent this hour kind of talking about Michigan. One game that scares me, and I didn't really talk about it last week, but that Rutgers game. And people are going to call me crazy, but you know why that game scares me. So I went back and looked at Greg Schiano's coaching history. That guy can coach. And here we are 3 years in. I'm not even going to count year one in 2020 because you're dealing with the COVID year. It's his first year on the job. They get to a bowl game last year, albeit at a 5-7 record. They pushed Michigan early in the year. It was 14-7. That was a close game. And I'm not saying they're going to beat Iowa, but Iowa has to go to Piscataway. All right. The last time Iowa went to Piscataway, I think it was very similar to that 14-7 score. 2016, I believe it was. It was a really talented Iowa roster with George Kittle and CJ Beathard and all those guys, and they squeaked by in Piscataway. And I just think it's a very odd time. Steve talked about timing for Michigan, the Iowa game on Michigan's schedule. I think the Rutgers game is very difficult timing for Iowa because, you have those opening three games. Sure, you're going to get up to the Cy-Hawk game. I would think by Sunday, September 18th, you're likely 3-0. I think that's the most likely scenario, even though I do think South Dakota State and Iowa State will be tricky. But there's a good chance you're kind of flying under the radar going 3-0. And is there a chance you start looking ahead to that Michigan game 1 week after the Rutgers game? And I just think having to go on the road across the country, different time zones, especially say that game is an 11 a.m. game. I mean, I don't know the travel schedule, and to Piscataway, but certainly that's a difficult assignment. I think that the early part of the schedule is tricky. I think that obviously the latter part of the schedule is the most difficult, but the early part of the schedule is tricky.
So as a former ESPN guy, I should have this locked and loaded, but I'm going to admit that I don't. I have in the past. Maybe somebody can correct me in the chat. So I'm going to give the rough framework to these TV selections. So ever since Fox came into the mix and took over the Big Ten, they, starting in 2017, took over the number one selection each season. And then I believe it alternates. And what they're selecting from are Big Ten conference games and also games that are hosted by Big Ten teams out of conference. So you'll see that Fox, their number one selection every year is Ohio State, Michigan. So that's their number one selection. And then maybe ABC /ESPN will counter with Ohio State, Penn State, So you've seen Ohio State and Penn State. They've actually played on ABC almost every year because that's usually the second selection. This year, though, with Ohio State Notre Dame playing week 1, ABC/ESPN countered with that as their number 1 Big Ten selection, which throws it back in the lap of Fox. And I don't know if it's continued past that. I don't know at what point that ceases to be from a grand scale of selecting for the entire season. But I would think we would get our, I don't know if they do that for just the top maybe 4 or 5 games, and then the rest are just week to week selections once we get there.
And I will add this in too. I know you're not a, it's got brought up on your call-in show last night, but the whole college game day discussion. I would have to think that college game day is discouraged. Maybe they're not. I know they've done it before. I think last year they went. Which game did they double up on the Michigan-Wisconsin game last year with Fox? I believe they did. I believe that was the big noon kickoff game. They doubled up.
They did on Ohio State and Michigan.
They did on Ohio State or Michigan.
But what game are you throwing out?
I thought it was Michigan-Wisconsin.
I think they did as well.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that is difficult. I think, you have a game like I don't know what the national schedule looks like. Do you have that in front of you, Mark? For
yeah,
a week,
I do.
Whatever what is that week?
Week 5. It's October 1st.
I'd be curious because that's the type of game I could see game day coming to. Now, again, it doesn't help the cause given the fact that you have the Michigan-Iowa game likely to be on Fox. If the gauntlet and the Big Ten that week were better, I think you have a better chance of landing game day there.
There are 4 games in the SEC that I would consider not to be marquee games, but to be just a cut under that, depending on how some of those teams play early, they could rise to that type of position. Alabama, Arkansas, LSU, Auburn, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, Mississippi State.
I mean, to me, those aren't. Is there anything else?
Oklahoma State, Baylor.
Yeah,
who were the 2 best teams in that conference last year.
That might be the one. Although, I hate to say this, but Baylor and Oklahoma State fans, I mean, that's not you don't have Baylor or Oklahoma State channels, right? I can take a shot at them. Those are not the most passionate of fans. Can we agree on that? Baylor and Oklahoma State?
Well, I don't want to clump them together. I think when you're removed, possibly anybody's removed from a situation, you tend to clump. It would be like clumping Iowa together with Minnesota or Wisconsin concerning some things that I think you would take some exception to. I think Oklahoma State fans, I think if we checked out attendance figures, that they would be year after year after year packing the place. Baylor, not so much. I'm going to separate those 2 brands in that way.
Do you think Oklahoma State's actually got a more passionate fan base than Baylor?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I would have seen it the other way around.
Just based on attendance figures.
Okay.
But that game doesn't rank on the national scale actually against those SEC games, but it's a more important game to that conference. And therefore, that could be a game that I doubt if either one's going to trip up before then, because I think they both play.
I could see that very easily being a college game day game. And maybe Iowa was, as far as games that are in Iowa City, Iowa, Wisconsin, maybe, but is Iowa going to be in a position to host game day in November? I don't think so with the schedule. So I know you don't care about it, but some people do. I wouldn't be shocked to see game day there in week 5 in Iowa City. That might be the best chance Iowa has to get game day.
Clemson, NC State. Okay. That's going to grab some attention.
Sure. Well, I mean, assuming Clemson, what's Clemson's schedule? I mean, that's the key. Those first few weeks, if Clemson starts off the year like they did last year,
I think it's more about NC State.
Yeah,
just making sure that they're
and they return one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Correct?
Yes, Dennis Leary, Devin Leary. Sorry, Dennis Leary's an actor. Devin Leary.
So, Mark, before we get off, we should mention Iowa's gaining a commitment for the 23 class. I discussed it on my channel yesterday, but I can go ahead and run through that real quick.
Absolutely.
Des Moines North's David Kalker, defensive end. had offers from Nebraska, Minnesota, Missouri, Northern Iowa, some decent offers in there, certainly. But again, most of the same offers that you're going to see from an Iowa recruit. This kid has got some really good intangibles. He's listed at 6'4", 240. Somebody commented, and I haven't verified this, but somebody commented on the channel yesterday that he weighed in at the camp over the weekend at 256. That's pretty darn big as a junior defensive end from Des Moines, I can tell you that. So physically, he's got some tools that could very well get him early playing time. I like how Iowa's recruited at the position, certainly with Aaron Graves coming in this year. Brian Allen, another 4-star that enrolled early. But again, as we talk about every year with this defense, Iowa likes to use 7 to 8 defensive linemen and rotate these guys in. That's kind of what Kelvin Bell has built this defensive line on. So they need depth. Calker, another good grab. Could he ascend to maybe 4-star status? Maybe he may be, as far as 23 guys who have kind of flown under the radar up until this point, he may be the one guy on Iowa's commitment list that has the best potential or opportunity to raise his stock. And he's had most of these offers have all come in. I think all of them, all the Power 5 offers have come in the last month and a half. So it's good that Iowa was able to get in on him, get him to camp, and get him to commit a day later. So I'll be intrigued. But I see Erica's comment in the chat. Aaron Graves is the guy that intrigues me the most, because boy, that kid, we've spent little time talking about him on this show. We talked about him when we were previewing defensive line, but I really like the personnel they have along the defensive line. It's going to be young, and I'm just talking even 2022. It's going to be very young, and you lose Van Valkenburg, but they've got some really good talent there, physical talent in guys like Allen and Graves. So I'm excited. But congratulations to Calker and Iowa, again, just plugging along. That's the one thing I kind of alluded to it with Steve. The two things going for Kirk Ferentz in Iowa right now that kind of helps fans to at least put up with what we view to be blatant nepotism. At least that's what it is. That doesn't mean I think Kirk's the worst person in the world. I still have a good amount of respect for Kirk Ferentz as a human being. I think he's a really good person. But I think what helps Iowa fans to put up with the Brian Ferentz promotions and the lackadaisical offense year in and year out is when you are winning 9 or 10 games. It's just hard ultimately, even though we all realize that they're winning in spite of the offense, it's really hard to, I mean, again, you're not calling for Kirk's head, nor should you, because it's hard to win 9 or 10 games. So it's that balance you have to find. But certainly recruiting, in addition to what Iowa's done here of late as it relates to record, Iowa's doing a nice job on the recruiting trail. And I keep saying this, but the 21 class was strong. Certainly the 22 class is really good because they added Wampa. 23 and 24 both look good. They're dominating the 24 class in the state of Iowa. So that's the one thing that surprises me. And I got to give Kirk a big attaboy, and I give his son-in-law Tyler Barnes some nobody's calling out nepotism because Tyler Barnes is a recruiting coordinator, Mark, because he's doing a good job. Now we'll see if they get Caden Proctor. That's the biggest one for 23. They lose out on Casper and Mark Way. It's going to be hard to get offensive players, especially skill position players. I think they have a shot at Proctor still. But I give them credit. They are doing what they need to do on the recruiting trail. 21 was a year that started very slow. Part of that was, I think, COVID as it relates to the recruiting trail, but Iowa now kind of ahead of schedule. That they're ranked in the top 3 in the country by, I think, 247 and Rivals for recruiting classes in 2024. Now, I don't buy into that, Mark, because most of these top-notch guys have not committed anywhere yet. I get that, but Iowa kind of it's just an odd situation, because you would think towards the tail end of a coach's career, especially a career that recently, whether you agree with it or not, there were some accusations of racial disparities within the program. The fact that he's been able to, ever since then, the last 3 to 4 recruiting classes have been really good. Some of the better classes of his entire career. That's odd to me, but I give him credit. They've managed to do that, and that's what helps fans to persevere.
I think the guy's an excellent coach. The criticisms here, at least I'll speak to my behalf, is just basically you're really good at what you do. It's difficult to win Big Ten games. Absolutely. Why can't we see a few places where we can strive to be great, even if it doesn't work out? that effort could be made in that. Not when I say effort, I'm not in any way making a claim that there's not enough effort, but the focus, the effort placed in those certain areas that could be improved. A couple notes before we take off. Mike, we love you being here. Thanks for being here. I just have to say, Mike, just give me a call on the call-in show at some point. I would love, it would be no greater pleasure for me than to tell you that you're right, that the Big Ten is the best conference in America, but it's not that close. I'm sorry to say, it's not that close. Uncle Rico, yes, I spend nights wondering, where is College Game Day going? I don't understand the fascination myself, but I know that there are people out there that care. If you're on campus, I get it.
Mark, how many hours did I spend toiling for this channel last September at College Game Day at 4
Did you not hear what the last part of my statement was? If you're on campus, I get it. Oh, let's go to College Game Day. It's coming.
Yeah.
Let's hope that they come to Penn State this week. But if you're, I don't understand. I don't get it. I have people asking me that every week during the season. Where do you think College Game Day is going to go next week? I don't care. I don't get the fascinating. It's the same show, basically.
Why don't you do a Mark, why don't you start a College Game Day at the Voice of College Football channel? And then you can go through each week. You can predict where College Game Day is going to be.
Make a mockery of it.
You can actually get a personality like myself. Well, I'm not going to do it, but you can find someone else that will actually.
You're not going to do it.
No, there'll be someone that will actually host the College Game Day at the Voice of College Football YouTube channel. Because we all know we all know that you need to start more channels. You don't have enough channels.
I need more channels for sure. If there's anything I need to do, look at that. You know what that is? I was going to post a video in response to everybody asking me about, but I was a little bit too late, and I would have nailed the first one. My prediction was Ohio State, Notre Dame, and I took the time to actually go through the schedule, and now it's null and void. I'm not going to do it now.
Why is it null and void?
It's null and void. They already selected the first game. I'm not going to go through the rest of the season and make my predictions on where they are going to. I don't know. I guess I could, but
I mean, I think it's great content. People love it.
They do. And that's one of the keys on YouTube. You don't produce what you want to talk about. You produce what the people want to see.
Yes. And I had a great time I'm giving you our time, but I had a great time out there last year.
Oh, I thought it was phenomenal. I was passed out in my bed, sleeping till 10 a.m. And every so often I would, barely wake up, and I'd reach and grab my phone and I'd click on it and see if Corey had posted some. And I could see, oh yeah, he posted something to like 6:40. Wow.
My favorite moment of that morning was when Seneca Wallace was at the local Lowe's signing autographs. So we were decided, hey, we're going to leave College Game Day because we got how many hours till game day actually starts. We're going to leave and go talk to Seneca Wallace at Lowe's. So, we're waiting to talk to Seneca, and we've got the live stream going. It's actually just by happenstance, it's actually pointing at the Lowe's building. And I just remember somebody commenting on the live stream, what exactly are we looking at here? And I just thought, this is beautiful. But it was great. I thought it was great content. Be able to talk to Seneca Wallace, maybe the greatest quarterback to ever play at Iowa State.
Sure.
I thought it was great content. I enjoyed doing it. Well, I wish that part of me wishes that Iowa could play again at Iowa State. I'll say this, Mark, if Iowa State were to host a College Game Day this year, I'd be happy to do that again. I don't know if Iowa State will, because I don't know. I guess before we get off, let me just look this up real quick. We've talked about Iowa State already, of course, because we had our good friend Levi Stevenson on the show. But I'm just going to take a peek here.
We know what their schedule is.
Well, we do, but I mean, that's true. I just want to see who
don't know who they're playing in the FCS or Group of Five. That's the only thing I don't know each year.
Yeah.
While Corey's doing that, let's make sure we honor these super chats. So Falconer X, thank you so much for contributing. We appreciate that. Mark, quote, Green Screen College Football Show. We've got Erica, who's contributed a few times. Thank you so much for that, Erica. Mark, did you ever get an Iowa helmet? I do not have an Iowa helmet. I counted 29 helmets the other day. No Iowa helmets. And also, who else? Wolverine Nation, thank you so much for contributing as well. Falconer X says, driving to Iowa tomorrow. Cannot wait to put my Miami flag on the dock at, you're going to have to fill in the name there for me.
No, let's try to say it, Mark.
Okoboji.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Look at you. You don't know Okoboji. See, that's
what is Okoboji?
Okoboji is Okoboji is really the only tourist trap in the state of Iowa. It's in northwest Iowa. We go up there every year. It's a fishing haven.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think they call them the Iowa Great Lakes. So that can kind of put in perspective what they are. But it's a really nice area, a really great place to vacation in the summertime. I know a lot of people go up there and ice fish in the wintertime. So where is Falconer X living? Is he living in Miami and come all the way up here there's no way he's doing that.
I know he's a Miami guy, Miami fan. Wow. I don't know.
Real quick. So I want to publish, I'm going to publish some content on this very topic. Iowa State, we talked about it, but Iowa State opens with Southeast Missouri State. One of the most shocking home openers in college football history. They open with Southeast Missouri State. Let me just say that. Second thing I'll say, the only options possibilities I could see for game day in Ames would be, and I don't even think this one was really a possibility, but their Big 12 opener is at home against Baylor. But I don't see game day going there unless they beat Iowa. I suppose if they beat Iowa and they're 3-0, maybe game day would consider that week 4. And then October 29th, they get Oklahoma at home. So I guess if they beat, even if they lose to Iowa, and if they beat Baylor, Kansas State, Texas, yeah, I could see game day. I don't know what the rest of the schedule looks like that week, but I could see game day possibly going there. But they're not coming to Ames for West Virginia or Texas Tech. So likely no game. I think there's a better chance that Iowa City gets a game day this year than Ames. And let me just say this, Mark, you may have heard this. Condolences to the families that lost daughters and friends and sisters here this past week in Ames. It's just absolutely tragic. We just, of course, we were covering it because of the website that we operate here in Ames, and it's just a terrible, terrible situation. I wish that I could spend time covering a college football game like we did last September, as opposed to having to cover deadly shootings. So condolences to the families, and I know that's an experience I hope I never have to go through.
Absolutely. Thoughts and prayers go out to all those families, certainly.
Yeah, it's all over. We know it's not just here in Ames, but of course it hits close to home, and most people consider Central Iowa, especially Ames, to be a pretty safe community, and certainly hit home last Thursday.
Thank you, everyone, for being here for another edition of Iowa Hawkeyes Live. We do this every Tuesday. For those of you who just showed up today, we do this every Tuesday at 4:30 Central. And so please come on back next
Mark, one
Tuesday.
more thing before you go off. We're continuing to look for more sponsors. If you want to sponsor the show, you know how to reach out to myself or you, Mark.
Absolutely. And we can let you know how this sponsorship will benefit you. So absolutely contact us. You can hit me up at markriderstv@gmail.com or either one of our Twitter accounts as well. All right, Corey, it was a good time.
We'll talk to you next week, Mark. Thanks.